Hello everybody and welcome back. Today I've got something really special for you. I'm going to show you 60 ways to visualize time series data in Tableau. I'm going to take my time creating each of these visualizations for you. But if it's a bit too fast, pause the video along the way so that you can learn how to build all of them. Let's get started. First chart we're going to build is a discrete line chart. Drag order date to the columns and sales to the rows. Click the plus sign next to year, fit it to the entire view, and there you have it, your discrete line chart. Next up is our continuous line chart. We're going to right click and drag order date to the columns, choose continuous months, and click on OK. Notice that we get an axis across the bottom. That's because our month field is continuous. Drag sales to the rows, and there you have it, your continuous line chart. Duplicate this sheet for our third chart type. All we're going to do is click on the path shelf, change our line pattern to a dashed line. And there we have a dashed line chart. Duplicate the sheet again. Click on path and choose dotted. Now we have a dotted line chart. Duplicate the sheet again. Click on path and make it stepped lines. This is now combining a stepped line with a dotted line. If you want to make it a solid line, click on the solid line. This is called a stepped line chart. For our sixth chart, we're going to look at a multiple series line chart. Create a new sheet. Right click and drag order date to the columns. Choose continuous months. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. All we want to do now is split this up by a dimension. Drag category to color, and there you have it, a line chart with multiple series. Create another sheet. Right click and drag order date to the columns and choose continuous months. Click on OK. This time we're going to use multiple measures. Drag sales to the rows, drag profit to the rows, and drag quantity to the rows. And now we have 3 different measures on a line chart. Let's go back to sheet 2 and duplicate the sheet. What we want to do next is put dots on the lines. To do that, click on the color shelf and on the markers at the bottom, choose the all option. And now we have dots on our lines, but there's another way to do that. Duplicate that sheet. Click on color and let's switch it back to the automatic option. Duplicate sales on the rows. Right click on the second sales field and make it a dual axis. Right click on the axis on the right hand side and choose synchronize. Right click on that axis again and choose mark type and circle. And now you have dots on the line, but they're a bit bigger now. Next up, we want to create a line chart, but we only want dots on the ends of the line. Create a new sheet. Right click and drag order date to the columns and choose continuous months. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. Click on the label shelf. Check the show mark labels option. At the bottom, choose min max. In the field option, choose month. If I click off of the label shelf now, notice we have the months on the ends. If we want to have the sales label on the end as well, drag sales to the label shelf. Now we have dots on the ends of the line, but it's showing sales. Next up is a moving average. Right click and drag order date to the columns. This time, let's choose continuous weeks. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. What we want to do now is overlay the weekly sales with the 13-week moving average. Duplicate the sales sheet. On the second sum of sales field, right click, choose quick table calculation and moving average. Right click on it again and choose edit table calculation. We want to set this up to be a 13-week moving average. We need to change the calculation type. Click on the average option, and in the previous values, we want to choose 12 and keep the current value checked. This is giving us 13 weeks. It's looking 12 weeks backwards and including the current week. That's 13. Close that window. Right click on the second sum of sales field and make it a dual axis. Right click on either axis and choose synchronize. And there you have it, a 13-week moving average with the weekly sales in the background. If we want to look at only the moving average sales, let's create a new sheet. This time, we want to look at a 3-month moving average. Right click and drag order date to the columns and choose continuous months. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. Right click on the sum of sales field, choose quick table calculation and moving average. Right click on that field again and choose edit table calculation. We want to make sure that our table calculation is configured properly. In the calculation type, we want it to summarize as an average. We want to do a 3-month moving average, so we have to go our previous 2 plus our current value. Close that window, and there you have it, a 3-month moving average. Next, we're going to go through a couple of different area charts. Create a new sheet. Right click and drag order date to the columns and choose continuous quarters. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. Change the mark type from automatic to area. If you want to drill down a bit farther to the monthly level, click on the plus sign next to quarter in the columns. I'm going to undo that to set it back to the quarterly level. What I want to do now is have a line going across the top of my area chart. Right-click on the sheet and choose Duplicate. Drag Sales from the data pane to the right-hand side to make it a dual axis. Right-click on that axis and choose Synchronize. Right-click on that axis again and change the mark type to a line. And there you go. Now you have a solid line above the area chart. Remember earlier, we used dotted and dashed lines. Let's duplicate this sheet. On the second Sum of Sales shelf on the Marks card, click on Path, and we can change the line pattern to a dashed line. Duplicate that sheet. Perhaps we want it to be a dotted line. Click on the Path shelf and choose Dotted, and now you have a dotted line at the top of the area chart. Next up, we're going to look at a couple of stacked area charts. Choose a new worksheet. Right-click and drag Order Date to the columns. Choose Continuous Month and click on OK. Let's mix things up and put quantity on the rows. Change the mark type to an area chart. Drag Category to the color. And now we have a stacked area chart. Duplicate that sheet. Instead of it being stacked like this time we want the categories to be a percent of total within each month. Right-click on the Quantity field, choose Quick Table Calculation, percent of total. Notice nothing changed. We need to configure our table calculation. Right-click on Sum of Quantity, choose Compute Using, and Category. Now you have a 100% stacked area chart. Now we're going to look at Change from the previous month. Click on a new worksheet. Right-click and drag Order Date to the columns, and choose Continuous Months, and click on OK. Drag Sales to the rows. We want to look at the month-over-month change. Right-click on Sum of Sales, go down to Quick Table Calculation, and then choose Difference. And now we have the month-over-month difference in sales. If you want to make it a bit more obvious, duplicate the Sum of Sales field from the rows to the color shelf. And now we see oranges and blues that define whether the change is positive or negative. Next, we want it to be a percent change. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag Order Date to the columns. Pick Continuous Months. Click on OK. Drag Sales to the rows. This time, we want to right-click on Sum of Sales, go to Quick Table Calculation, and make it a percent difference. Now notice, this looks quite different than our previous chart. The previous chart was just the difference month over month. This chart is the month over month as a percentage change. Let's say that we want to also view this by category. We can drag Category to the rows, and I'm also going to put Category on color to make it a bit easier to distinguish the lines. But we want to double check our table calculation to make sure that it's treating each category separately. Right-click on the Sum of Sales on the rows and choose Edit Table Calculation. In our Table Calculation window, choose Specific Dimensions, and we want to make sure that Category is unchecked. What that means is that's going to allow each category to be treated separately. Create another new sheet. This time we want to look at the change versus the first date. Right-click and drag Order Date to the columns, pick Continuous Months. Click on OK. Drag Quantity to the rows. In this example, we want to compare the quantity for every month to January of 2020. To do that, we're going to right-click on the Sum of Quantity on the rows. Choose Add Table Calculation. In the calculation type, we're going to leave it as the difference from. In the relative to, we want to choose first. And now, all of the change is relative to January of 2020. If we want to split this up by category, we can drag Category to color. We have 3 lines. Let's double check our table calculation to make sure that each category is being treated separately. Right-click on Sum of Quantity on the rows. Choose Edit Table Calculation. In the Specific Dimensions, we want to make sure Category is unchecked. Close the Table Calculation window, and we're all done. We can easily switch this graph to be a percentage change. Duplicate the sheet. Right-click on Sum of Quantity on the rows, and choose Edit Table Calculation. In the calculation type, we're going to change it from difference from to percent difference from. The chart is now showing us the percent change versus January 2020 for each category. Next up, let's look at cumulative sales. Create a new worksheet. Right-click and drag Order Date to the columns. Pick Continuous Months and click on OK. Drag Quantity to the rows. We want to make this a running total. Right-click on Sum of Quantity, choose Quick Table Calculation, Running Total. But it would probably be a bit better if we split this up. So let's drag Region onto the color shelf. And now we see the running total for each region. We want to do the same thing now, but as an area chart. Right-click on the sheet and choose Duplicate. Remove Region from the color. Change the mark type from Automatic to Area. And now you have your running total of quantity by month. We're going to do something a bit different for this next one. We're going to look at the cumulative sales versus the first sale date for each subcategory. Create a new sheet. To show you how this is going to work, I'm going to drag subcategory to the rows, and then right-click and drag order date to the columns. I'm going to pick order date discrete. Click on OK. Notice that the first date of sales is different for every subcategory. Accessories didn't start selling until January 9th of 2020, whereas paper started selling on January 3rd. What we want to do in this example is look at the cumulative sales based on the first sale date of each subcategory. I know that might sound a bit confusing. Hang with me. Clear the sheet. First thing we need to do is get the first sale date for each subcategory. To do that, let's create a calculated field. I'm going to call this first sale date by subcategory. This is going to use a level of detail expression. Start with a mustachio, and we want to fix it on each subcategory because we want each subcategory to be treated separately. Then a colon, and then we want to get the first date for each subcategory. So we want the min function and order date. Close off the mustachio. Click on OK. Now we want to look at the days that have elapsed since that first sale date. To do that, we're going to create another calculated field. I'm going to call this one elapsed days. Our calculation here is the date diff at the day level. Our start date is that calculation we just created. First sale date by subcategory. And then our end date is the order date. Click on OK. Now Tableau put that down here in the measures area because it's returning a number. But we don't want to do any types of aggregation with these elapsed days. We want them to be a dimension. Drag elapsed days up to the dimensions. Right-click on it again, and let's convert it to be continuous by default. Drag elapsed days to the columns. Drag sales to the rows. Drag subcategory to the color shelf. Now normally I wouldn't use 13 colors, but I'm doing it here just so you can see what this example is doing. Right-click on the sum of sales in the rows. Choose Quick Table Calculation and Running Total. We want to double check that this is computing for each subcategory. Right-click on Sum of Sales, choose Edit Table Calculation. We want to choose specific dimensions, and we want to make sure that subcategory is unchecked because we want to compute the elapsed days for each subcategory. Close that window, and now you have the elapsed sales for each subcategory since the first sale date. Next up, we're going to look at a couple of column charts. Create a new sheet. Column charts work much better with discrete dates. Drag order date to the columns to get your discrete years. Let's click on plus twice to get it out to the monthly level, and I'm going to remove quarter. Drag sales to the rows. Change the mark type from automatic to a bar. Change the fit from standard to entire view. And there you have it, a column chart of sales over time by month. We're going to duplicate this sheet and make it a stacked bar chart. Drag category to the color, and that's it. We have a stacked column chart. Duplicate that sheet again. This time we want to make it a percent of total stacked bar chart. Right-click on sum of sales, choose Quick Table Calculation, percent of total. Again, it doesn't look like the chart did anything because we need to configure our table calculation. Right-click on sum of sales, choose Compute Using and Category. And you'll see now we have a 100% stacked column chart. This next one I think you're going to like. Create a new sheet. We're going to create a Lollipop Chart of profit over time. Right-click and drag order date to the columns. Choose Continuous Months and click on OK. Drag profit to the rows. Change the mark type from automatic to a bar. Click on the size shelf and choose Manual. And you can increase the size if you want. I'm going to leave it the way it was. Duplicate the Sum of Profit field on the rows. On the second Sum of Profit shelf, change the mark type from bar to circle. Click on Size and increase the size of the circles till you get them just the way you want. Right-click on the second Sum of Profit on the row shelf and choose Dual Axis. Right-click on the axis on the right-hand side and choose Synchronize. Now it'd be better if these stood out whether they were positive or negative. So go to the All Marks card and drag Profit to the color shelf. And now we can easily see that we've got a couple of months with negative profit. There's your Lollipop chart over time. Next up is a paired column chart. Create a new sheet, drag order date to the columns, and expand out to the quarters. Drag sales to the rows. Change the fit to entire view. Change the mark type to a bar. Now we're just looking at quarterly sales, but we want to have categories side by side. Drag category to the columns, and then drag category to the color. And this is called a paired column chart. The only way to really see the trend for each category is to highlight it. What might make more sense is to have a separate bar chart for each category. Let's duplicate the sheet and drag category to the left of year. And now, because we have category on color, it's easier to see the trends for each category. Create a new sheet. This time, we're going to look at a bar inside of a bar. To do that, we're going to create a couple of calculations. We want to get the latest year sales and the prior year sales. Create a new calculated field. Let's call this latest year sales. Our calculation is if the year of order date is equal to mustachio max year of order date. This is getting the largest year in the entire data set. Close off the mustachio. So if those are equal, then we want to return sales. End. Click on OK. Duplicate that calculation. Edit the copy. We're going to call this one previous year sales. All we need to change in the calculation is to subtract 1 from the max year. Click on OK. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and pick discrete months. Click on OK. Notice we have headers for each of the months. Let's change the view from standard to fit entire view. Drag latest year sales to the rows. Change the mark type to a bar. Drag previous year sales on top of the axis for the latest year sales to create a combined axis view. Tableau added measure names to the columns. Let's move measure names to the color. If I click on latest year sales on the color shelf, notice they're stacked on top of each other. We want them to both start at 0. Go to the analysis menu, choose stacked marks, and then turn them off. Now they're piled on top of each other. We need one of them to be thinner than the other. Drag measure names from the data pane onto the size shelf. Now we're looking at the latest year sales versus the prior year sales. I would probably adjust the colors a bit here. I'm going to leave my latest year sales as blue and change my previous year sales to a gray. And now we can easily see when the latest year sales has exceeded the prior year sales. Next, we're going to look at an alternative to this same chart. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and pick discrete months. Click on OK. Drag latest year sales to the rows and change the mark type from automatic to a bar. Last time, we had a bar inside of a bar. This time, we want to have the bar for the latest year sales compared to a reference line for the previous year sales. Drag previous year sales to the detail shelf. On the analytics pane, drag on a reference line for each cell. That means we're going to get a reference line for each month. In the value, change it to previous year sales. Make sure the label is off. In the formatting, increase the opacity to 100%. Untick the Show Recalculate option. Click on OK. And now we can see the sales for the latest year compared to the sales for the prior year. We could add a bit of color to these bar charts to make it even more obvious when one exceeds the other. Create a new calculated field. I'm going to call it Sales Increase. I'm going to drag sum of latest year sales from the rows and say, is that greater than the sum of previous year sales? Click on OK. Drag that Sales Increase field onto the color shelf. And now we can see where one exceeds the other. Edit your colors, set the false to red and the true to blue. And there you go. We can see when sales exceeds the prior year or not. Next up is a combination chart. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and choose discrete months. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows and change the mark type to a bar. We want to compare this to profit. Drag profit to the right-hand side to make it a dual axis. Right-click on that axis and choose mark type and then line. What this is trying to do now is show the relationship between sales and profit by month. A better view of this would be comparing latest year sales to prior year sales. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and pick discrete months. Click on OK. Drag previous year sales to the rows and change the mark type to a bar. Drag latest year sales to the right-hand side to create that dual axis view. Right-click on that axis and synchronize. Right-click on that axis again and change the mark type to a line. And now we can see latest year sales versus prior year sales as a combination chart. Next, we're going to look at a couple of deviation charts. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and pick continuous months. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. What we want to do now is compare each month to the average across all of the months. As an example, if we drag on an average line for the table, we want every month to compare to that average line. So we need to take this average reference line and turn it into a table calculation. Go back to the data pane, create a new calculated field. We're going to call this window average sales. To turn a reference line into a calculation, we want to choose window average and then drag in sum of sales. And that's it. Click on OK. If we drag window average sales to the rows now, you'll see we get a constant line of 48,000. If we hover over the reference line, we get the same value. Great, so we know that's working right. Now we need to compare the window average sales to the sales. Create a new calculated field. Let's call this sales versus average. Sum of sales minus, and then drag in your table calculation. Click on OK. Drag sales versus average to the rows and remove the other two fields from the rows. Change the mark type to a bar, and now we can see the sales for each month compared to the sales for the entire period. If you want to split this up by years instead, drag order date to the columns. But now we need to reset our table calculation to make sure that the average is computed by year instead of across the entire view. Right-click on your sales versus average field on the rows shelf. Choose Edit Table Calculation. In the specific dimensions, we want to uncheck year so that the average is recalculated every time we get to a new year. Close the table calculation window. To make it more obvious which ones are positive and negative, duplicate the sales versus average field from the rows to the color shelf. Another alternative for this would be to make it a line chart. Right-click on the sheet and duplicate. Remove the field from the color shelf and change the mark type from a bar to a line. I would make it a bit more obvious that this is a comparison to the average. So I'm going to format the window, go to my lines. In my 0 line, I'm going to make it a solid line, make it a bit thicker, and make it dark. And now it's more obvious that we're comparing to some sort of baseline. Hang with me, we're about 2/3 of the way done. Create a new sheet. This time we're going to build a cycle plot. Drag order date to the columns, click on the plus sign to break it out by quarters. Move quarters to the left of the columns. Drag sales to the rows. What this is telling us now is how sales have changed for each quarter across the years. A better way to accentuate this is to go to the analytics pane, drag on an average line for each pane. So in that case, it means for each quarter. If you want a bit more detail, you could expand the quarter to the months and remove the quarter field. Change the view from standard to entire view. And there's a cycle plot. These are really useful for looking at seasonality. Next up is a calendar heat map. Create a new sheet. In a calendar, we have weekdays going left to right. Right-click on order date and drop it on the columns and choose weekday. Click on OK. Right-click and drag order date to the rows and choose week discrete. Click on OK. Drag sales to the color shelf. But we need to split up the weeks by their month. Let's filter first to a year. Drag order date to the filters, choose years, and then next. And let's pick 2023. Click on OK. Now we've got some holes in here now. That's because there's some weeks where there were no sales on those weekdays. Right-click and drag order date to the rows to the left of the week field and choose month. Click on OK. Starting to look like a calendar now. Right-click on the week field and uncheck Show Header. Right-click and drag order date to the labels and choose Discrete Days and then OK. Now notice our mark type changed. It changed to a text field and is coloring the text. On the marks card, change the mark type to a square. And there you have it, a simple calendar heat map. Most of the time though, you're probably going to want to filter this to a single month. What I would do in that case is right-click and drag order date to the filters, choose month year, and pick a single month, let's say December 2023. And then I remove years from the filters. And now you have a calendar for December of 2023. Make the view a bit bigger. Click on the label shelf. In the alignment, set the day to be to the right and to the top. We're used to seeing upper right for calendars. Right-click on the month header and uncheck Show Header. Click on the color shelf, and in the borders, I like to pick a light color to divide up the days. Next up is a slope graph. Create a new sheet. Drag order date to the filters, and we're going to compare 2 years. Let's say we want to compare 2022 to 2023. Click on OK, and drag order date to the columns. Notice order date is discrete, it's blue. Drag sales to the rows. Now this is a slope graph. It's actually just a line chart. In this case, a line chart and a slope graph are the same thing. But we want to split this view up by subcategory. Drag subcategory to the detail shelf. And now we can see some of the lines go up and some of the lines go down. Now we want to color these lines by whether there's an increase or a decrease. Create a new calculated field. We need to get the sales for each subcategory for each year. Let's call this subcategory sales increase. The first thing we need to do is get the sales for 2022 for each subcategory. It's going to be something like this. We want to say if the year of order date equals 2022, then we want to get the sales, and we want to wrap that whole thing in a fixed level of detail expression. So type in a mustachio, and then fixed at the subcategory level, add in our colon, and then put in a mustachio at the end. And we need to make sure that we wrap this if statement in a sum. That's going to give us the 2022 sales for each subcategory. Copy that, and then paste it. We want to change the first year to be 2023. This is now going to give us 2023 sales, and we want to say, is that greater than the 2022 sales? Click on OK. Drag that field to the color shelf, and now we can see the year-over-year increase or decrease. Edit the colors. Set the true to something light and the false to red, because we want the year-over-year decreases to be the ones that stick out. What if we want to do this as continuous instead of discrete? Let's duplicate the sheet and change year to continuous. Notice we get the same kind of view, but it's really wide. I'm going to go over to the right-hand side of the chart, look for my left and right arrows, and drag that over to the left-hand side. What I like about having it as continuous is I can now put reference lines on here to box out the view. Go to the Analytics pane. We're going to drag on a reference band for the table for year. It's going to go from the year min to the year max. That's good. Let's turn our labels off and turn our tooltips off on both the band from and the band to. We want to set our lines to be a dashed line and set our fill to none. And then untick recalculate. Click on OK. And now you have these nice lines that you can see where 2023 and 2022 are. You can't do that when you have discrete years. Next up, we want to create a diverging bar chart. We're going to have 2022 sales go one direction and 2023 sales go the other direction. Right-click and drag order date to the rows and pick discrete months. Click on OK. Drag latest year sales to the columns. Change the mark type to a bar. Drag previous year sales on top of the axis for latest year sales to get a combined axis view. Now notice they're both going to the right. Move measure names down to the color shelf so we get a separate color for each one. In the measure value shelf on the left-hand side, double-click where it says sum of previous year sales and put a minus sign in front of sum. And now you get a diverging bar chart. Notice our values have these negative signs in front of them. Right-click on measure values on the columns and choose format. In the scale, choose numbers and then custom and set it to 0 decimals. We still have our negatives. Go down to custom again and remove the minus sign after the semicolon. And now everything is formatted as a positive value. The other way we could do this same chart is with a dual axis chart. Create a new sheet. Right click and drag order date to the rows and pick discrete months. Click on OK. Latest year sales goes to the columns just like last time. Change the mark type from automatic to a bar. Drag previous year sales to the top to make it a dual axis chart. Double-click on sum of previous year sales in the columns, put the minus sign in the front, and now we have our diverging bar chart. Next up, Sparklines. Right-click and drag order date to the columns, and pick continuous quarters. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. Drag subcategory to the rows. To make it a sparkline, we want to shrink up the height of each row, and we want to take the right-hand side of the line chart and drag it over to the left to make it a nice tiny line. Right-click on the sales axis and choose Edit Axis. We want to uncheck Include 0 and make each of the axes independent. Close that window. Right-click on the sales axis and uncheck Show Header. Right-click on the quarter axis at the bottom and uncheck Show Header. Shrink the view up a bit more until they all fit. And there you have it, Sparklines. Next up, we're going to do Spark Bars. Create a new sheet. Drag order date to the columns and then split it out by quarters. Drag subcategory to the rows. And this time, let's look at profit. Drag profit to the rows. Change the mark type from automatic to a bar. And I'm going to drag profit onto color as well. To make these sparklines, we want to right-click on the profit axis and choose Edit Axis. And we want to make them independent. But because we're using profit and it's going to be both positive and negative, I'd recommend you leave the include zero checked. To make these spark bars, just shrink up the space between the years, shrink up the space in between the rows, right-click on the quarter header and uncheck Show Header, right-click on the year and uncheck Show Header, right-click on Sum of Profit and uncheck Show Header. And there you have it, spark bars. Next up, we're going to do a Spark Area Chart. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag Order Date to the columns. And let's pick Continuous Quarters and click on OK. We're going to build this very similarly to the Sparklines. Let's drag Region to the rows this time and Sales to the rows. We want to change our mark type from Automatic to an Area Chart. Right-click on the Sales axis and choose Edit Axis. We need to leave Include Zero checked because we're using an Area Chart. Area Chart should always include zero. But we want to choose the Independent option. Close that window. Right-click on the Sales axis and uncheck Show Header. Grab the right-hand side of the chart and shrink it down. Go in between the regions and shrink those up. And now you have a Spark Area Chart. Okay, we're getting there, I promise. New sheet. Next up, we're going to look at a dot plot. Drag Sales to the columns and Subcategory to the rows. Change the mark type from Automatic to a circle. We want to see a dot for every month. Right-click on Order Date and drag it to the Detail shelf. Choose the Month Year option and click on OK. And now we have a dot for each month for each subcategory. We want to color code the dots whether they're above or below the average. We already have a sales versus average field, so let's drag that to the color shelf. Right-click on that field and choose Edit Table Calculation. We want it to restart every time it gets to a new subcategory. So choose Specific Dimensions, uncheck Subcategory, and check Month. Close that window. Let's make it 2 simple colors. Double-click on the color shelf, set Step Colors to 2. Click on OK. And now we can see which months were above or below the average. Next up is a barcode chart. Create a new sheet. Let's again drag Subcategory to the rows and Sales to the columns. Change the mark type from Automatic to a Gantt bar. We want to see the distribution of sales for every day in the dataset. Right-click and drag Order Date to the Detail shelf and choose Order Date Discrete. Click on OK. Click on the color shelf and reduce the opacity so that you can see better where the marks overlap. And that's a barcode chart. Now let's create a connected dot plot. Create a new sheet. Drag Subcategory to the rows, Latest Year to the columns, change the mark type to a circle. Drag Previous Year Sales on top of the Latest Year Sales axis. And we get a color for each dot. Now we want to connect those 2 dots together. Duplicate the Measure Values field on the column shelf. We now have 2 marks cards. Choose the second Measure Value shelf on the marks card and change the mark type from circle to a line. Move measure names from color to path. Right-click on the second axis and choose Dual Axis. Right-click on the axis and choose Synchronize. We want the dots to be in the front, so right-click on the bottom axis and choose Move Marks to Front. Right-click on the axis at the top and uncheck Show Header. Now this is a solid line. We could go back to our second Measure Values field and click on Path and change it to a dashed line or a dotted line. Totally up to you how you want it to look. Now we want to create an enclosed dot plot. So let's duplicate this sheet. It's the exact same steps, except we're going to do something a bit different with the line. If you've changed the path to a dashed line or dotted line, switch it back to a solid line. Click on the size shelf, and you want to increase the size of the line until it goes around the circles. Go to the Circle Marks card, click on the color shelf, and set the border to white. Let's go back to the Line Marks card, click on Color, and let's make it a light gray. And that's how you create an enclosed dot plot. Create a new sheet. Next up is a circle timeline. Drag Subcategory to the rows, right-click and drag Order Date to the columns, and pick Continuous Months. Click on OK. Change the mark type to a circle, and drag Sales onto the size shelf. If we click on the size, and we increase the size of the circles, you'll see they begin to overlap. That's okay. Let's duplicate the month field on the column shelf. Now again, we have 2 marks cards. Go to the second month shelf on the marks card. Change the mark type from a circle to a line. Take Sum of Sales off of the size shelf and duplicate the month field onto the path. Click on Size and reduce the size of those lines. Right-click on the axis and choose Dual Axis. Right-click on the axis and choose Synchronize. Right-click on the axis at the top and uncheck Show Header. What you should see by now is I'm repeating a lot of these steps to build very similar charts. Change the view to fit entire view. Maybe increase the size of the circles. Click on the color shelf and reduce the opacity. And that's how you create a circle timeline. Next up, we're going to create a bump chart. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and choose continuous months. Click on OK. Drag sales to the rows. Drag subcategory to the detail. We want to rank the sales for each subcategory for each month. Right-click on the sum of sales field on the rows shelf. Choose Add Table Calculation. The calculation type we want to use is a rank. In the Compute Using section, choose specific dimensions. I want the ranking to restart every time we get to a new month. So I need to uncheck month and check subcategory. Close that window. Now we need to reverse the axis on the rank so that our highest rank is at the top. Right-click on the view and choose Edit Axis. And then choose the reversed option. Click on OK. If I show the highlighter for subcategory, and I pick a subcategory, you'll now see where it ranks across each of the months. Next up, we're going to create what's called a seismogram. A seismogram takes half of the value and goes to the right, and half of the value and goes to the left. To do that, we need to create two calculated fields. Create a new calculated field. Let's call it sales, 1/2 positive. We're going to take our sales and multiply it by 0.5. Click on OK. Let's create another calculated field to have half of the sales go to the negative direction. Sales, 1/2 minus. Our calculation is minus sales times 0.5. Click on OK. Right-click and drag order date to the rows and choose month year. Click on OK. Drag sales 1/2 plus to the columns. Drag sales 1/2 minus on top of the axis to create that combined axis view. We've built this lots of times already. Tableau is now split up the view based on measure names, but we want to connect the values left to right. So move measure names from color to path. When we hover over one of the lines, we only get half of the value. So drag sales onto the tooltip. Right-click on measure values on the columns and uncheck Include in Tooltip. And now we can see, no matter where we hover, we see the sales for that month. And that's how you create a seismogram. A close cousin of the bump chart is called a parallel coordinates chart. Create a new sheet. Right-click and drag order date to the columns and pick continuous months and click on OK. We're going to drag sales to the rows and subcategory to the detail. What we want to do now is we want to take the maximum value, the minimum value, and then look at where each subcategory falls in that range. You'll see in just a second. Let's create a new calculated field. We're going to call this our parallel sales. We want to take the maximum value, which is the window max of the sum of sales. We want to subtract from that the window min of the sum of sales. That gives us the range from the top to the bottom. Wrap that whole thing in brackets. What we want to do now is we want to compare each value to the minimum. So sum of sales minus the window min sum of sales. Now wrap that whole expression in brackets to create our numerator, and then divide one by the other. So let me explain how this works. If our maximum sales is 100 and our minimum sales is 1, we have a range of 99. So if I'm the maximum value, I'm going to have 100 minus 1 is 99. And then my entire range is 99. So that means I'm at 100% of the value. Click on OK. Drag parallel sales on top of sales on the rows to replace it. Right-click on parallel sales and choose Edit Table Calculation. We again want to make sure that it computes by subcategory and restarts every month. And what you see here is chairs is the highest selling in January 2020, and you can see its pattern from then on. So if I look at chairs over here on the right, in April of 2023, chairs was only 30% of the maximum sales for that month. That's called a parallel coordinates chart. I think you're going to really like this one. We're going to create a calendar of donut charts. Let's start by creating a donut chart. Double-click on the columns and type in the average of 0. Change the mark type to a pie. Drag category onto color and sales onto angle. Duplicate the average of 0 field on the column shelf. On the second average of 0 shelf, remove category from the color, move sales to the tooltip, and change the mark type from a pie to a circle. Click on the size shelf and make them smaller. Click on color and make it white. Right-click on the axis and choose dual axis. Right-click on the axis again and choose synchronize. Again, the same steps we've been doing over and over and over again. Right-click on the axis at the bottom and uncheck show header. Now we want to make this sort of like a calendar heat map. Drag order date to the columns and leave it at years. Drag order date to the rows and change it from year to quarter. And now we have a small multiple donut chart. Probably never use this, it's not very useful, but I think it's pretty fun to create. New sheet. We're going to look at what's called a connected scatter plot. I have another data set in here that is from Gapminder. If you've never seen Gapminder in action, look up Hans Rosling on YouTube. We're going to compare the fertility rate to life expectancy at birth. Drag the country code to the detail shelf. Change the mark type to a line. And now the line's going all over the place, but we want the line to be connected by year for each country code. So drag year to the path shelf. And now, if you click on one of the lines, you can see how life expectancy compares to fertility rate over time. This is called a connected scatter plot. You could also duplicate this sheet and change the path to a dashed line. Another way to do this would be to duplicate the sheet, drag year to the pages shelf, change the mark type from a line to a circle. On the right-hand side, check the Show History option. Click on Show History. We want to show the history for all marks, and we want to show the trails. In the Trails option, let's choose dotted lines. Increase the speed, and now when you hit play, you're going to have a connected scatter plot that animates over time. All right, last chart. I think we're at 60 now. Create a new sheet. We're going to create a stock chart. We have a tech stocks data source, and I'm going to just choose one company. Let's say Meta. Click on OK. Right-click and drag the date to the column shelf. Pick Date Discrete and OK. So this is going to give me every date in the data set. Change your mark type from automatic to a Gantt bar. Drag the open to the rows and drag change to the size. If you also drag close to detail, we can see the open, the close, and the change for each day for that stock. I would probably also drag change to the color shelf so that we can see the change over time. Change the view from standard to entire view. And there we have it. I'm pretty sure that's 60. At least it's 60 in my notes. If you have any questions, please leave comments. Again, take your time going through these. Pause the video along the way. I want to make sure you understand everything that's happening here. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with someone else that'll find it useful.